Toronto's waking up under cloud cover and cold air, while Ottawa is trying to redraw parts of Canada's trade map, and the Maple Leafs are staring down a deadline that could change the room. Later in the brief, why Canada's reset with India is already running into a credibility test at home. Cloudy and cold in Toronto today, around -7 to 2 degrees Celsius, and no rain or snow expected. Now to a few quick, familiar things to start. Police in Peel say a 2022 disappearance in Mississauga is now being treated as a homicide. Investigators are asking for any information about suspicious activity from roughly June through September of that year, connected to a woman last seen in the Applewood Heights area. Also in Mississauga, the province's police watchdog is investigating after an officer-involved shooting that followed a domestic disturbance call. Police say there was an exchange of gunfire. The man died at the scene, and investigators say 2 firearms were recovered. The SIU is asking the public to come forward with video or other evidence. And a local health warning to keep in mind. Toronto police are flagging a cluster of overdoses in and around Allen Gardens and Moss Park, tied to an unidentified narcotic. City data are already showing suspected overdose calls running well above last year's pace. Sports, with the trade deadline now close enough that it's affecting how teams feel day to day. Multiple reports say the Leafs are preparing for significant movement, with a strong hint they may act more like sellers than buyers, but without touching the franchise cornerstones. We'll come back to what that could look like, because the next few days are where leverage shifts fast. Turning now to the main thread. Prime Minister Mark Carney has arrived in Australia, landing in Sydney midday Tuesday local time. With a clear message, Canada wants deeper collaboration with Australia on trade and defence. What's happening is straightforward. Carney is expected to meet business leaders in Sydney, then head to Canberra, where he's scheduled to address Australia's Parliament on Thursday. He's also set to speak Wednesday at the Lowy Institute, one of the country's most influential foreign policy forums, and he's expected to meet Prime Minister Anthony Albanese later this week. Here's the key point. This trip is being framed as part of a wider push to diversify Canada's trade and security relationships, with Australia presented as a like-minded Indo-Pacific partner with overlapping strategic interests. There's already a concrete defense link in the background. Canada and Australia signed an agreement last year for Canada to buy an over-the-horizon radar system from Australia, intended for Arctic use. That detail matters because it anchors the relationship in something more than speeches and photo ops. It's procurement, capability, and long-term planning. Why it matters now is partly timing and partly optics. Carney has not spoken with reporters for several days, and his office cancelled a planned press conference in India after his meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So, Australia becomes not just a policy stop, but a visibility moment, a place where the government can set tone and priorities without the conversation being dominated by a single bilateral controversy. And that brings us to the reset with India, which is the other major signal in this week's diplomacy. Canada and India announced what's being described as a new partnership, with memoranda covering areas like energy and critical minerals, and an ambitious goal to conclude a full free trade deal by the end of this year. There's also a major commercial headline. Cameco has signed a 9-year uranium supply contract worth about $2.6 billion, with deliveries beginning in 2027, intended to fuel Indian nuclear reactors. Why this matters locally is that the government is explicitly selling these deals as an alternative to over-reliance on the United States, meaning the impact isn't just diplomatic. Over time, it shapes jobs, investment, and where Canadian commodities and energy flow. But the risk here is credibility, and it's already showing. One senior Canadian official said the government believes India has changed its behavior and is no longer actively conducting interference or transnational repression in Canada. Other officials immediately complicated that message. The public safety minister said there's a lot more work to do, and Canada's spy service has continued identifying India as a key foreign interference concern. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand also distanced herself from the senior official's specific wording, pointing instead to guardrails. So, even as the trade and energy push accelerates, the security file remains unresolved and politically sensitive, including within parts of Canada's Sikh community and among some MPs. This is where the Australia trip fits in. It reinforces the idea that Canada's diversification plan isn't a single bet on a single partner. It's a broader portfolio: trade, defense, and strategic positioning. Quickly back to the Leafs, because it's the same theme in a different setting: decision points and timelines. The NHL trade deadline is Friday, March 6th. Reports suggest Toronto has multiple players drawing interest, heavy in-person scouting at recent games, and a front office willing to consider deeper roster cuts, but with top stars still considered unlikely to move. If the Leafs do sell, the question becomes whether it's short-term cap and assets or a retool meant to keep next season competitive without sliding into a rebuild. The final piece to watch tonight and tomorrow is messaging versus mechanisms. On the diplomacy side, listen for whether Carney in Australia gives a clearer public read on how Canada balances trade expansion with interference concerns, because right now, officials are not delivering a single consistent line. On the local side, watch for updates from investigators in those Mississauga cases, and for any further alerts on the unidentified drug tied to overdoses downtown. That's the brief for Tuesday, March 3rd.